Today I'll be speaking with Dean Withers, who's a liberal political commentator, but I want to give you a little bit of context before doing so about what prompted this conversation. He posted on X about his MAGA brother kicking him out of the house that they lived in together over political differences. He ended it by saying MAGA derangement syndrome is very real, folks. So we'll dive into that. But first, here's a little bit of him making this announcement on a live stream to his audience, and then he'll explain it as well to all of you.
I got kicked out of my brother's house. He turned my power off while I was on live. In live, walk out. Brother's like, get the hell out. Get all of your shit and dip. He ended up kicking me out because he's alt-right Christian conservative. I'm liberal content creator. He called me the Antichrist. He called me an agent of chaos. It was absolutely unreal. I cannot believe that my biological brother that I grew up with would ever do that.
And now I am joined by Dean Withers himself. He is a liberal political debater. And I want to talk about what we played in that intro, Dean. Thank you for joining us. If you lay out, well, first I want to say, obviously, normally I wouldn't discuss publicly such intimate, private family matters, but because you've chosen, and we talked about a little bit before recording why you chose to do this, to bring this out on your own platform publicly, I thought it might be interesting to dive into your story, as I think it demonstrates something a lot of people, maybe not to the extent that you're currently experiencing, which, by the way, as all of you can see, he's in between permanent living stations, we'll say. And your story is something a lot of people, like I said, maybe not to that extent, are going through within families where the political divisions are coming all the way into our homes in such a major way. And then in your case, in one of the most horrendous ways you could imagine. So first, lay out for the audience the story that you've been talking about on your platform that you're currently in the middle of dealing with, and then we'll go from there.
Of course. So for the last 6 months, I've been living with my brother. We hold very different political and social beliefs. He's very conservative as well as very Christian. And for the most part, I've been able to make it work out with him, as well as, a lot of my other family members that are, conservative as well. I think the biggest thing, that I've recognized in my personal life is that the way to positively influence, or just more so just by kind of humanizing, a lot of the issues that the left is so adamant about, by having very easy discussion about them time to time with the family members. And, for the most part, that story's been true of me and my brother. For a long time, we were able to uphold a positive relationship, but for the last little bit, things have taken a turn for the worse. It got to a point where just 2 days ago, he turned off the power while I was, on stream, and then had told me to pack my stuff and get out. And, in talking to him, while this was all unfolding, he had called me things such as the Antichrist and an agent for chaos. He was able to wrap in, his very conservative Christian beliefs, and he had brought up points such as the idea that God turned chaos into order, and I'm this agent of chaos that just wants to see the world around me kind of burn because of a lot of the things that I say and do online to do with, me being a Democrat and whatnot. And it was very sad. It was very sad to see. And I mean, this is a theme also reiterated by a lot of my other family members that also happen to be conservative as well. I think for the most part, the MAGA, party has been able to sow itself into, millions of American families across our country, and just create hate and division, even within families. And, it's just gotten to such a point where my brother is so far gone down that rabbit hole of conspiratorial beliefs about the government, about our political parties, and is so co-signed to, every word that comes out of Donald Trump's mouth, where, when Donald Trump calls Kamala Harris crazy, radical communists, and those points rebound and resolve within him, even looking at his own brother. And this is a very, personal and private family issue, and I typically don't share those online to millions of people. But I find, just such a great educational value in the story. This is a very real world, example of exactly how, the political scheme in America today has created division and torn a family apart.
Wow. So there's so much to go through there. I do want to get to sort of what role we can play or what guidance I'd give to our audiences in managing those situations and how your experience informs that. But first, to get a little bit more information on the specifics, tell me, it's, as you said, it was totally livable for a while. And it's something that you could, of course, we should always place our family as such a high priority. And sometimes that means seeing past horrible political differences. I do want to know, by the way, I hate that MAGA has conflated their distortion of Christianity with that label Christian. And so then people associate it with many things I don't think at all are aligned with Jesus-esque principles, but that's a whole different point. But tell me, what do you know on his end? What caused it to escalate from I can deal with our political differences to you need to leave?
And I think that's kind of the question, that we're all asking, including myself. And I ultimately think that it just had to do with him kind of putting the sock in his mouth and kind of forcefully dealing with those political differences, because I think even from his perspective, he could make that realization that we should place family above all, and political differences between me and him, can be dealt with in a very positive, manner. But then just after so long of dealing with those political differences, just the mere knowledge that they exist, it ultimately ballooned and exploded.
And did y'all debate a lot? Were you constantly hashing these things out, or was it off the table?
For the most part, I have always tried to keep those things off the table with my family. Something I've seen a lot online since kind of talking about, the story on my own platforms is, maybe Dean is, acts the same way towards his brother, towards his family members that he does towards a lot of people on the internet. And that's not the case. I think that, overwhelmingly I do, guide myself off of a principle of trying to make the world around me a better place, not just on the internet, but also interpersonally with my family members. And I just find a vastly different approach to be more beneficial for guiding, the beliefs of my family members in a positive direction. And it's not that harsh, constantly debating, debate style rhetoric that guides my family in the right direction.
Yeah, I've
I try to stay away from that.
Learn. Yeah, sorry. And to the audience, we're dealing with a little bit of tech problems, so the delay might cause a little bit of stopping and starting. But so far, everything's coming through pretty clearly. I've noticed as well, Dean, there's one type of approach to political discourse, which is admittedly a little bit more performative whenever you're in a debate and you're trying to explain and defeat someone with your explanation. And that's fine, and that can be a way for an audience member to see who has the more dominant point, but that's not how you, just for all of you in the audience, taking what you see in debates online is not always the best guidance for personal life discussions. And for me, a lot of listening is involved in making progress with people in my life and trying to move them over. So it's interesting to hear that it's not even like y'all were doing the types of debates that you're engaged in online that led to that, but it sounds like he was keeping up with what you were doing and got in sort of a spiral, feeling like you represented something really bad, which it is so difficult, but it's important that we learn to coexist amid huge gaps in our principles. Obviously there's a line, and I was going to ask, I saw you in one of your videos, and then we'll move off of the specifics, say that you don't see a relationship there. Are you leaving, as I would encourage you to, even though I don't know too much about what's going on and this is your situation, but the door open if he were to reach out and want to mend fences?
Well, I mean, I think at the moment, no. And, that has to do with, some of the other more personal things that he had said to me, just kind of lashing out with anger. For the most part, I've really only chosen to share, some of the things that he said to me that have related to, our ideological splits, to, his version of his faith in Christianity and how that would relate towards reasons why he, chose to, quote unquote, kick me out. And there's plenty of other things that he had said that, don't really have a place in a public discussion just because they don't have any relevance towards politics that, kind of make that impossible for the moment. But, I always do have, a place for people, regardless if they're a family member or not. If they're open to, growth and change, that, there's always a place for them, to not only be accepted by myself, but also to be accepted by others. And I think that you kind of described it perfectly. Something you had said there was, online you see these debates where you want to prove a point, prove them wrong. And, that's my whole get down. I do political debates full time. But, something I've always admitted was that with a lot of the people that I have these discussions with on the internet, the goal of the conversation is never to convince them that I'm right. The goal of the conversation is to expose the people listening in that I'm right. Through the use of, some of the more education and, or I guess, through the use of knowledge in which I share throughout the conversation. Because, that style is very hard to change change the mind of a person that vehemently stands against you with that very, harsh debate style. And there's definitely more effective ways to try to communicate a positive message interpersonally, especially to your family members.
Yeah, absolutely. And from what I can tell from what you're sharing, it really does sound like you're, even with things that we're not aware of, but you were trying so hard to, as we talked about, prioritize family, which I find so important. But what's difficult is it takes two to tango on that. And this happens, you mentioned outside of family, just with me and conversations and people that I like on a personal level, but then I hear them talk about politics and I'm like, what? No. It's hard to know exactly where the line is, but there is a line when it's, all right, that's too indicative of a core value that I'm going to have a difficult time existing around. And also I know that most people don't want to only talk about politics, but if someone has a position that's outrageous enough, sometimes I feel like I can't do anything other than pry on that and want to make some progress there, and it can drive people crazy. But it sounds like even with your differences with people, even your brother, up until a point, you're very willing to yourself make the concession of setting some of that aside. But as I've dealt with in personal relationships as well, that only works if they're going to meet you halfway. And so that gets to kind of the next part of this, detaching from the specifics of what you're going through. And I'm so sorry. That is, I mean, even just the setting that you're sitting in exhibits kind of the chaos that has taken place because of a political division, which is so heartbreaking. And I'm, again, so sorry about that. But I do want to explore you as someone who is involved in the division a lot. You're in debates demonstrating what the division and values are. For you, how do you think we play a part in this? So obviously I agree with you that MAGA has introduced a uniquely divisive characteristic, I should say, to American politics. And I think there's unique blame in the MAGA echo chamber and the type of hate that spews out of that. As you've engaged with it, to those who are willing to discuss and are willing to grapple with these issues, not agree and ignore the differences, but at least speak with one another with some level of dignity, how do you think we should approach those conversations so that we're not also fanning the flames needlessly, but then we're also not conceding on our values, because we can't do that either?
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting question that deserves a lot of focus. So I mean, I think that difference in belief, especially in politics. I mean, something that changes a lot of individuals' lives. Will fan the flames. Will create division, regardless of what side you're on. I mean, I think about this a lot. Like, for instance, ending slavery in America was one of the best decisions that our country has ever made. Yet that decision created so much division. It started a civil war. And I think what that kind of tells me is that advocating for what you stand for, advocating for what you think is right, will always carry that potentiality, or even in some circumstances certainty of creating division, because not everybody thinks what you stand for is the good. And I think that kind of tells me that division isn't always bad, and sometimes it's required to achieve a greater end. And the only times I see division being created by individuals such as myself, and a handful of others, is like when I tell a homophobe that being gay is not wrong. In fact, it's natural and it's ingrained into our neuroanatomy. And then they start exploding and going all bananas because I'm disrespecting their quote unquote religious beliefs or everything that they stand for, or pushing this agenda on them that they hate, and all these other excuses. I mean, I think that advocacy for the good can create division. And to respond to your question about how we could try to avoid as much of that division as possible, is truly through education of our youth. I mean, that's ultimately my goal, is to try to stigmatize, plenty forms of bigotry, to try to stigmatize these beliefs that unfortunately exist in the political scheme in America today that are really harmful to our country and our people in it, and to promote education for the younger generations in America today, in hopes that they will never grow up to hold those same bigoted beliefs. So if we could just avoid people having those bad beliefs in the first place through education, there's going to be no need to create that division to get people on the right track, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. And again, this is separate from what you're currently going through, because that cross lines. But with other things, one of the things I've been wanting to advocate more, and you do this, I mean, you're engaging with MAGA constantly in these debates, and your audience is there for it. So maybe it's not as much of something you resonate with, but I see in the space that I'm in, there is a certain level of, I'm wanting to pick the word correct. So I think there is a notion that I find silly, that by ignoring these beliefs or not engaging with them, not confronting them, and just sort of pushing it out of the dialogue altogether, will defeat them. Like the bigoted belief you're talking about, or the incorrect stances on democratic values, whatever it might be. And you are a living, breathing example of someone who's very willing to jump on platforms and debate with people. And so one of the ways that I think we could be better as a movement is being more willing to hash it out on these things, as you're doing. And I credit you with that. Do you agree that there's a little bit of a sense in some of the online left of, let's not quote unquote platform or normalize these views,
yes,
by even talking with them?
Yeah, I've experienced a lot of that pushback myself for plenty of the conversations that I've had with these figures that, either a typical institutional Democrat or someone further on the left would never dream of engaging in 100 years. And I think that there's, two things that could be said. So, I mean, like, first of all, for the people on the left that I've interacted with a lot that say, well, you shouldn't platform this racist Nazi that wants to further racism, misogyny, that I mean, kills people and completely destroys individuals' lives. To some level, if I don't correctly represent my views and I'm unable to defeat his views, through the use of, logic, rationale, etc., that ultimately, the evil will prevail. More people will be exposed to these bigoted beliefs that generate so much harm in the world around us, and that may even predisposition more individuals towards holding those beliefs themselves, which is the outcome that a lot of the people on the left that say don't platform these bad beliefs, always think will occur, and that's why they don't want to platform those bad beliefs. But at the same time, if we just completely leave these beliefs alone and we are never engaging with them, when we're never giving them pushback, if we're never discrediting them, they'll only fester and grow through complacency, and they'll exist in these very harmful echo chambers. And I think something that I've always wanted to do personally, and I absolutely advocate for others to do as well, is to disrupt those echo chambers. But in order to disrupt the echo chamber, you got to go into it first. You got to place yourself in those environments, having those very uncomfortable conversations. And I guess even to take this like one step further, a lot of the times when we're addressing these issues such as racism and misogyny, you put a black person, you put a woman in those spaces faced with people like Nick Fuentes or Myron Gaines, etc. The amount of backlash that they will receive because of their race or because of their gender existing in those spaces that uplift those bigoted beliefs to such a high level is an immense level of harm. They will be, discredited, reputed because of, their race or their gender, and will face so much backlash. It almost shouldn't even be their burden to do that, right? So I, I guess getting a little bit more into the weeds here, I'm a white guy, going into those spaces with, these incredibly bigoted assholes that, shit on black people, shit on women, shit on members of the LGBTQ plus community. None of those traits personally apply to me. And that gives me a certain level of privilege entering into these spaces. I've kind of heard this theme repeated a lot. I think I almost have an obligation to go into those spaces and have those hard conversations and hopefully change some minds because of that privilege that I have that others don't. And it is ultimately so beneficial for all of our futures to start disrupting those spaces. Because when you let them fester, when you let them grow, well, then all of a sudden, we'll just have more of these young men being intrigued and going into these spaces because they think it makes sense. I have a shining example of this. I talk to a lot of people about more misogynistic beliefs. One of them is that men are better at leading than women. And one of the arguments that I hear all the time is that men are better at leading than women because there's been more men in positions of leadership historically. And, on a very surface level, to, a more ignorant, undereducated individual, I could see how with, a single thought, they'll think that makes sense. And the only way for us to change their mind, because they think that they've derived these very bigoted conclusions with the use of logic and reason, is to explain to them why it doesn't make sense. Give a counter argument, right? Address, maybe how some of that reason is more fallacious and how that yielded conclusion is false. And the way you could explain to them why that doesn't make sense is by having conversations or quote unquote platforming, right? Some of these more bigoted creators, like the names I've previously mentioned, such as Nick Fuentes, Myron Gaines, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. And it's quite I think you're correct that people's identity can induce different levels of backlash. But to anyone who's willing to do it, I think it comes with a huge responsibility that you don't mess it up. Because if you're going to go to try to pop the bubble, if you're not prepared to do so, then it can embolden those folks. And so the amount of time and effort that I know a lot of, or that I know you and others who spend a lot of time debating put into that as a craft, as a skill, is a part of upholding that standard that is a little bit of an obligation if you're going to engage with such harmful views. And for my audience, we don't talk a ton about the people that Dean has engaged with, but we're talking about, as he said, the furthest of the far right, and Nick Fuentes being one of them. And then one other thing is I'm trying to do, I've laid out very clearly, and a huge premise of my show is how harmful the broader MAGA movement is. And then now I'm also taking time to make sure that as we oppose that, how can we be the best at doing it? How can we be the most compelling in our messaging? And that takes a little bit of introspection within the movement. And one of the things I've seen as another criticism internally is there's this sense that there's an opposition to growth from some within the left. And I think you have an interesting anecdote about that that phenomenon. Someone tried to sort of exploit it to take you down within your own side. I'm talking about a big TikToker, I guess would be his label, Bryce Hall. And when you started blowing up just recently, this latest wave of going on Jubilee and talking with all these different people and gaining a bunch of followers, he kind of came after you, thinking that he could use what is a flaw within our side, I think, which is sometimes we'll take past things people have said or past stances they've held and go, no, I cannot associate with you and I'm not going to forgive you and you can't grow. And the fact that you've been so public to say, yeah, that's who I used to be, here's the growth, is an example of what I think we need to do better, which is people have had harmful views. People maybe currently have harmful views, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't encourage them to grow and then celebrate them when they do. So lay out that anecdote and then sort of what you learned from it.
Luke, I think that you raise an interesting point here, and I love talking about this so much because I think that there's such a value, in these discussions. But before I do respond, I do want to give credit where credit is due. I've seen so many people on the left, thousands and thousands and thousands of people on the left, listen to me talk about where I came from and where I am at now and what that journey has looked like, and understand it. And I gotta give that credit where credit is due. But to kind of open the dialogue to a lot of the people who may be watching that aren't familiar with me in my past, as I kind of hinted at earlier, I grew up very Catholic, conservative, in a county that voted 71% for Trump in this last election, with a very conservative family. If you haven't been able to pick that up already, even with a discussion about my brother, and growing up, I engaged in a lot of the same forms of bigotry that I now so vehemently advocate and preach against. For instance, when I was younger, I used racial slurs, which was, off the bat, racist and wrong, and shouldn't be accepted, even though I was so young when I did. I think that, what really matters, that I talk about so much, is one's ability to grow from harm and bigotry, become a better person, and hold themselves accountable for their past. And, I've gone on this quote unquote journey since, a younger age to where I'm at now, where I've been exposed to education on a lot of these very critical topics that I now so vehemently stand 10 toes behind. And I've completely shifted my own worldview, and I think I've become a better person. And a lot of that has included accountability for my past. And in fact, the reason I do what I do today was because I once stood in a very similar position to a lot of the people that I talk to today. And I know the only thing that completely changed and shifted my perspective on society as a whole is that education that I now go on live to share with others every single day of the week. And so far to your question about, some people's on the left's unwillingness to accept growth and change, I'd say that we do see that sometimes. But from my own perspective, if I'm being honest, that hasn't been the majority. I feel as if, my own story coming out and being so readily available to so many people, the fact that I used to engage in these bigoted racist actions, I don't now. The reason I no longer do is because of education, and I've accepted genuine accountability for that, and I now try to share that same education with others. I don't see that much backlash from the left. If anything, right, I see the most backlash from people on the right that project their unwillingness to change onto me and others a lot like me by saying, I can't change. or an acceptance of Donald Trump and his unwillingness to hold himself accountable for anything wrong he has ever done in his entire life, by projecting that onto me or people like me by saying, well, you haven't held yourself accountable. And, there's nothing that you could truly do to hold yourself accountable, because the moment they see and accept the fact that a 20-year-old white boy can hold himself to a higher level of accountability than the next president of our country, that'll completely crush, their internal perceptions of reality. So I guess to your question about the left, once again, I haven't seen it that much.
That's really good to hear. Yeah, and that's great because I guess some of this is me just projecting my own experiences. We've gone through, not with me, but with people I've engaged with, like right now, doing a show with a right winger, and she's sort of making some progress in not being as hateful. And some people say, don't do that. Don't spend that time because there's no chance for change there. There's no hope for growth. And why are you even wasting your time? And I think if we start believing that everyone who has harmful views, and I'm not even just talking like, oh, they disagree on the tax rate. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying really, really harmful, hateful, destructive views. If we believe all the people who support leaders that represent those views just have horrible hearts that could never be changed, we're in a much tougher spot than I think we are. And you keep using the word education. It really, not for everyone. Some people really are driven by some deep hatred that's probably not going to go away. Yeah. But there are a lot of people that just stumbled into a social media echo chamber, or they grew up in an environment where they thought things, believed things, and then acted accordingly, that if they were spoken to, sometimes this takes a lot of talking and a lot of educating, they can end up aligning with what I like to believe is their real heart, which is much less hateful. And so it's really good to hear that that's been your experience with our movement and sort of embracing your growth. I think that's a great place to leave it. Dean, thank you for joining us. Thank you for talking about pretty difficult details. I hope everything is going to be all right over the next few days and weeks as you figure out your situation. Where can people find you?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thank you so much for your time today, Luke. You asked some good questions, and I think that there's been some good conversation that has transpired from this video. If you are interested in learning more about me or finding me on social media, you could find me on TikTok by just searching up my name, Dean Withers. I'm sure that my account will pop up pretty quickly, as well as on YouTube at Dean Withers as well. It's a smaller account right now. I haven't used it at all yet, but who knows, I may start using it a whole lot real soon, depending on the outcome of the potential TikTok ban, as that's my main platform. You could also find me on Instagram at Dean Withers and Twitter at Dean Withers. I appreciate you for the conversation, Luke, and for everybody listening in. I appreciate you taking some of your time out of your day to listen to this conversation.
Thanks, Dean.
Of course, Luke.